A loving look at the world of comic books, old-time classic comic books on the Outdated Entertainment Hour. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Outdated Entertainment Hour. My name is Bob Smith. You may know me from my sister podcast, the Outdated Wrestling Hour, or you know me from 1,000 different magazines across my career. Hope everybody's doing well. We are back with our usual nostalgia, and we're going to look back at the world of comic books. We're going to go back in time with Cory Strode, who seems to be an expert on those classic magazines, those mini magazines we used to call comic books. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for the nice response to our recent shows. We've got a lot more coming up in the future. We're going to be on eventually bi-weekly, but at this point, it should be every 14 days or so. And we got a lot of cool stuff coming. And we're really thankful, again, for all of you out there, and especially folks in Canada who really seem to like the show. So thank you very much. So we'll take a quick commercial break and come back with Cory Strode and tights, spandex, capes, masks, Superman, Batman, the Hulk, Captain America. Who knows where we're going to venture off to? Venture to the Avengers, maybe. We'll find out. We'll be right back.
This is Joe Walsh. One thing I do when I'm not playing rock and roll is get on the air as an amateur radio operator. Also called ham radio, is a communication service provided by ordinary people just like you and me. We have a national emergency communication system in place 24/7, 365. Find out more about amateur radio at arrl.org/What is ham radio? See you on the air.
Okay, Outdated Entertainment fans, I know this is going to be a great podcast. You know why? Because this is take 2 already. We've already had our first technical snafu, so that's usually good luck with these things. And I've got good luck in a second way because we have a gentleman here. The gentleman has one of the longest running comic book podcasts in the world. His name is Cory Strode, and we're going to talk about all kinds of things together. Cory, welcome, my friend.
Thank you. Anthony Pyrus, who is my co-host over at PWInsiderElite.com on the AEW post-show party, always plugs my podcast, which is Crazy Comics and Stories. We've been going since 2010. And he said, oh, this guy wants to talk to you about comics. And the first thing in my head was, boy, they're going to have to narrow that down a lot. We've been doing a podcast since 2010. Myself, my lifetime partner, Joe Ryder. Joe used to own a comic shop, and then he owned a second comic shop. Now, I worked at a comic shop, and then I ran the Minnesota Comic Book Convention for a decade.
Wow.
And somehow people think of me as a comic historian, which I tend to think it's no, I've just read a lot of comics since I was 3 years old. My mother told me that there was a time when she would, rather than read, regular kids' books, she would read Uncle Scrooge comics and Donald Duck comics and stuff like that. And there was a time I wanted her to read me one of the comics. She was busy making supper. And by the time she came out, I was sitting on the couch sounding out the words in an Uncle Scrooge comic, which I still have, and was drawn by Carl Barks. And then by the time I was in 5th grade, one of the kids on the bus said, oh, you need to quit reading these kids' comics. You need to read Marvel comics. and the obsession was born, and I have not stopped reading ever since.
Comic books, I believe, and I've always talked about this. I was a writer, professional writer for over 35 years. I think they were the conduit to learning about good grammar and spelling and phonics and everything else. I think comic books were an invaluable part of my youth growing up. Do you feel the same way?
Well, yeah, especially because Marvel in the 60s and 70s really wanted to kind of break out of the perception of comics, because comics were considered trash. There were a number of reasons for this. Part of it was that in the 40s and 50s, they demonized comic books as causing juvenile delinquents. So they in 1954, they created the Comics Code, which got rid of a lot of the violence and a lot of the crime and a lot of the horror, and juvenile delinquency was solved. But then in movies and TV after that, the way you would show someone's an idiot is to have them read a comic book. So that kind of got ingrained in the culture, and Marvel in the 60s and 70s really wanted to break out of that. So whenever, if you were a college student and you wrote into Marvel, oh my gosh, your letter was getting printed so that they could say, college students are reading this stuff. And now that I'm older, it's like, who? College students? They're idiots. I was a college student and I was an idiot. But it was a way to sort of elevate the stuff. And you also had editors who thought of comics as garbage. Over at DC, the editor of Superman in the 40s, 50s, and through the 60s was a man named Mort Weisinger. Terrible human being. He was abusive to his creators. He took credit for stuff. There are all these stories about how someone would come in, pitch a Superman story. He would tell them it's garbage and they don't know what they're doing, and yell at them and scream at them, and they'd leave. And then when the next writer came in, he would feed that story idea to the other writer, so that all the writers kind of were fighting each other and wouldn't be asking for more money. But he often told people, my Superman comics are for slightly slow 8-year-olds. Whereas over at Marvel, you had Stan Lee, who was, I'm writing for college students. And then into the 70s, you had other people who were, I'm writing for adults. Mm-hmm. And it showed in the stories they told and the way the art was laid out. Eventually, DC sort of caught up with them in the 80s.
Right.
But you have to remember that back in the 60s, and even before then, comics were thought of as kind of disposable trash.
Yeah, my parents were included in that. No, I'll tell you a story. I was really, really big on comics. I had one of my dad was in the service. He had an old Foot Locker, and he let me use it to store my comic books in. But they always rode me like a government mule over my comic book collection. You're wasting your money on them funny books. I'm from upstate New York. Yeah. And I had a nice collection going. I had doubles of the original Jack Kirby Silver Surfer, which is now worth, I think, $17,000 a copy mint. I remember having doubles of this. I had I was an equal Marvel and DC fan. First comic book I ever bought with my own money, I remember, was 12 cents. That has to be late 60s, right? Then they were 15.
12 cents would be before 67.
Right. So probably the middle of 60s, right? And then they went to 20 and then 25 and then 50 and
15.
Then right, 15. Yes, in the interim, you're absolutely right. And they kept going up.
If you want, I could tell you a really nasty story about when they went from 15 to 20.
Go ahead.
About how this is how Marvel became the #1 publisher in the 70s. The cost of comics was starting to go up. And there was kind of a backdoor agreement with Marvel and DC. And the publisher at Marvel was gaining on DC. But what DC and Marvel did, they kind of sat down and said, all right, we're going to have to raise prices. We're going to both raise prices at the same time. We'll raise the price to 25 cents, but rather than a 32-page comic, we'll do a 48-page comic. And they kind of sat down and met with the printer and made this agreement, and that the month that changed, Marvel and DC, 25 cents, more pages. The next month, Marvel cut back to 32 pages, 20 cents, without telling DC.
Mm-hmm.
So DC's books are 5 cents more expensive. Didn't matter that you got more pages to kids who, well, I could buy 4 comics. I could buy 4 DC comics for $1, or I could buy 5 Marvel for $1.
Mm-hmm.
And that is finally the thing where Marvel started outselling DC.
Interesting. That's
Yeah.
a nice anecdote right there. I wonder how the distributors figured in, because, magazine distribution, I was in the magazine business. Magazines were always a big, major pain. They kind of controlled everything. Once it was sent to the distributors, it went out into the wild, and you didn't even know where the things were going. Did comic books have a problem that way as well?
Comic books pretty much almost died because of it twice.
Mm-hmm.
In, I think it was either 56 or 57, you had American International Distribution. That was the name of the company. And they distributed everything. They were the biggest magazine distributor. They distribute comic books and paperback books and all that. Well, they got bought by another company, and that company realized that the land that the warehouses were on was worth more than they would make distributing magazines for a certain number of years. So they shut down their magazine distribution immediately. Boom.
Bang.
You killed off a whole bunch of comic publishers, a whole bunch of magazine publishers, paperback books, which were mostly put together by the magazine publishers at the time. They took a huge hit. The one thing that I always find interesting is that was Playboy's distribution.
Right.
And Playboy had started publishing a humor magazine by Harvey Kurtzman, who'd created Mad. They'd hired him away to publish a humor magazine. They had another kind of a celebrity magazine. Well, the only one that survived was Playboy, because Playboy had subscriptions, so they could rely on the subscriptions until they got new distribution. But if you look from 54 to 57, comic book sales just collapsed. Then in the 70s, comic sales were just horrible. At DC, they were publishing 3 books to sell 1. Marvel wasn't as bad. It was 5 books to sell 2, but they were still printing and getting tons of returns. But there were these...
What part of the 70s are we talking about there?
Early 70s.
Okay,
early 70s.
That's when I was reading.
72 to 75.
Oh, okay. I probably quit around 71, 72. After years of my parents saying, "Don't do that," so I stopped doing it and gave my comic collection to my cousin, which is a really, really one of the dumbest things I've ever done. But in any event, so I my knowledge base is Silver Age into about when Neil Adams was on top.
Okay,
and that's when I cut it off right about then. So anyway, continue. I didn't mean to get in your way there.
You had these comic book specialty shops. And what they did, first they went to DC and said, we want these books directly to us. We don't want to have to go through the distributor. We want them directly from you, and we'll tell you how many we want, but we want a bigger discount. And what DC said is, all right, we can do that, but you're going to have to take them on a non-returnable basis. They were more than happy to do that because, hey, back issues. They weren't going to return anything anyway. So you started this the first one was called Seagate Distribution by Phil Seuling, who ran comic book conventions in New York and up and down the East Coast. And then you had other places who wanted to get in on this. Marvel got in on this. And as it went on, by the time you got to the 80s, I know here in the Midwest, you couldn't get DC Comics on the newsstands anymore. They no longer had distribution. Superman no longer could get distribution on newsstands. Batman, Wonder Woman, etc. You could only get them in specialized comic shops, to the point where it's rare to see a comic on a newsstand. I think the only ones who have newsstand distribution right now is Archie with their digests.
Oh, yeah, right.
Because you could, let's say you're Marvel, I'm going to publish a new Ms. Marvel comic. Before you even go to press, comic shops place their orders. Oh, I've got orders for 70,000 of this issue. I don't have to print any extras. I'm not going to lose any money on this. You know your profit before you even go to press. when you were at pro wrestling magazines, imagine how happy they would be if they knew we're going to print exactly 300,000 and they've all sold. What are the stores with them? That's not our problem. We get paid the minute those magazines hit the store.
That sounds too good to be true. Right?
Well, the problem with it is it means that kids don't see comics anywhere but comic shops.
Right. That is
and they've
absolutely
been fighting
true.
that for 30 years.
Right. Well, here's a question about today's modern comics. Like I said, I go back to the era of the spinner rack, which I love dearly. I really did. I never saw a spinner rack that it didn't make me excited. How about you? Did you like the spinner racks?
We had spinner racks, but the ones I liked better were the big. There was a newsstand in Canton, Illinois. I'm from Central Illinois, a small town called Smithfield of 250 people. And when we could go to Canton, which had 1,200 people, the newsstand there had this thing toward the back. It was kind of a big wooden box. And there would be a comic slid into a slot, and you could slide it up, and there would be a stack of that comic behind it. And to me, that was so much cooler than the spinner rack because it's like, oh my gosh, look at all this. They've got everything. Whereas on the spinner rack, the comics could get bent, and it was messy. And one of the reasons why those spinner racks went away was because after about a week or so, those comics would look beat up and crappy, and stores don't want their merchandise looking all beat up and crappy.
Right. And if you did have some comics fans, they would it would look great once the rack jobber filled it, but 3 days later it's going to look like a mess and everything's out of order, and somebody looked at a book and put it in there backwards and stuff. It just didn't have a fresh look after Tuesday, which used to be distribution day in my area.
Yep. You also had a problem with when I started reading comics, they were 25 cents.
Right.
Now, a Slick magazine, let's say, a wrestling magazine, was $1.
Right.
They take up about the same amount of space on the rack. You get 5 cents profit from that comic. You get 20 cents profit from that magazine. Which are you putting if you're thinking dollars per square inch?
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons Playboy was so popular with newsstand operators is because they had one of the highest payoffs per single issue of any magazine ever. I think let's say if Playboy in that era cost $1.50, I think the newsstand was getting like 50 cents or 75 cents.
Yeah.
And that was a big enticement to carry those products.
And they also had huge subscription sales.
Right.
And if you've got huge subscription sales, you've got really high-end advertising.
Yes, and they did.
Now with comics, if you look back at the comics of the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, you've got the lowest of the low-end advertising.
Johnson Smith Company.
Yep.
Right.
So they were making nothing off those ads. Not until the 80s when they started getting video games and movies and everything. But there was kind of a point where they could either go, we're going to make money off advertising, or we're going to make money off the comics themselves. And they kind of went to the comics themselves, whereas other magazines went to, we make our money off advertising.
And you know what? The wrestling magazines were exactly like that too. Yeah. I mean, in terms, they would sell some stuff and got a few ads, but it was all wrestling related stuff. You weren't getting Coca-Cola and Budweiser, no. At least not in that era. Anything that was pulpy did not get big time ads, that's for sure.
No.
Paper, anything printed on paper that wasn't slick, we'll put it that way. That's actually a good way to look at it, I think.
Well, and also wrestling for the longest time had a reputation as well of lower economic fans. So if you're Coke, am I going to advertise in Woman's Daily or Woman's Weekly or The Wrestler?
Exactly right.
Well, I'm going to put it in Women's Weekly. I'm going to put it in McCall's. I'm going to put it in Cosmopolitan. Now, that may have changed a bit, but the advertising world in magazines is completely dead. I often talk about older fans are like, we need to get comics back on the newsstands. Well, there aren't any newsstands.
That's right.
We have I live in Chaska, Minnesota. We have 4 grocery stores. Not a single one sells magazines except for the rack right by the checkout. And all of those are paid slots. The Inquirer pays to be there. Whatever magazine you see at the checkout, they're paying to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I doubt there are a lot of magazines that have the funds to pay that cost every week to be in that rack.
Right. It's funny. I have a very large, 2 of them, Barnes & Noble stores near where I live. I'm in the New York City area. And one of them has an incredible selection of magazines. I mean, I'm talking maybe 10 racks, large.
Yeah.
And they do have some comic books on display. And I'm just wondering how they're all making it at this point, because it's like, again, if you find a magazine in the United States now, it's usually on an end cap in a drugstore or a supermarket, not in a newsstand. And I just don't know how they're doing it at this stage. And as someone who's been publishing my whole life, paper costs now are through the roof. Anything that's printed is very expensive to do. And yet I still see slick paper magazines. But then again, that's why you see a special Life magazine edition about, let's say, the musician Prince, one of those slick things you see in an end cap. Those are $14.95 a piece.
Well, because the New Yorker's $8.99 an issue, and most of your magazines that are hold on through subscription sales.
Right.
So that's why when a lot of publishers will see the magazine on the newsstand as just advertising the subscription.
Right.
So comics, however, develop their own distribution, which is going through huge changes right now. But that's not the outdated part of this.
Right.
But they're going through huge changes right now as companies try to jockey to get more. They're publicly held. Marvel's owned by Disney. DC is owned by Warner. Dark Horse is owned by a game publishing company. Let's see. Boom Comics just got bought by Penguin Random House. You're getting, these companies are getting bought up. And if, you've worked in the world where, hey, you got to show more profit this quarter than last quarter. And if you don't, you're out the door and they'll find somebody who will.
Right.
Comics are trying to find new ways to make that money, to find new readers and new ways to get there. When you go to that Barnes & Noble, you probably see a huge section of graphic novels.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely true.
That's where comics are growing. They doubled over the pandemic sales of graphic novels. And I honestly believe that within my lifetime, the monthly 32-page comic will go away.
I was talking to Brian Solomon on one of our previous entertainment shows here, and he's been hearing that maybe DC may just fold, DC Comics, and that he heard something to the effect that the superheroes are important as properties to sell to movies and television, but as comic books, there's no profit anymore. So they're actually thinking of cut and bait. I don't know if it's true or not, or it's just a rumor, but I could actually see that happening, which makes me very sad, to be honest with you.
The people who said that are gone. One of my friends who works in comics is looking to put out a book that says comics are dying and have been since 1941. Because the people in comics have all been saying since day one, this isn't going to last. With DC, here's the dirty little secret about DC and Marvel. And here's the numbers that I used to prove it. You've had 3 Guardians of the Galaxy movies that have made, through everything, over $3 billion. Those comics were research and development for these movies. So you could take 0.1% of all the money they've made, and that would still be more than the cost of publishing every Guardians of the Galaxy story since 1968 to now. Comics are an amazing research and development. So The companies that see that, that's why Penguin Random House bought Boom. Hey, we're getting this idea factory. It's why the video game company bought Dark Horse. They want the idea factory. Marvel wasn't even up for sale when Disney bought it. Disney just came in and said, you've made a couple movies that make a lot of money. We need to find a way to sell to boys 8 to 16. You do that, so we're going to buy you and Star Wars, and now we have the male 8 to 16 market under our belt. I think the graphic novel sales will keep these companies going. The reason you have comics and then a collected edition is the comics sort of amortize the cost. When you do the comic, that's going to pay the writer, it's going to pay the artist, it's going to pay the colorer, the letterer, all the people, everything. That comic makes a profit. That way, when you collect that 6 issues or 10 issues into a book, you've already paid the writer, the artist, the editor, the editorial staff, and the book itself, you can sell that book for less because you've amortized those costs, and all the person who, the writer, the artist, everybody will get royalties instead of their initial page rate, which was paid for by the comic.
Okay.
It's a very different type of business, and a lot of people even fans don't understand it because they look at it as, well, I've been buying Spider-Man for 20 years. Why are they changing this? Why are they doing that? Well, because that issue of Spider-Man, it's going to go onto a digital site. It's going to be sold digitally. It's going to be collected in a book. It's going to be translated to all these other countries. And the people at Marvel and Sony are going to see, is there an idea we could take from this for a movie?
Yeah, I buy that wholeheartedly. I mean, it's like that's where the money is, and that's where. So you've opened my eyes to a part of the business I had no idea of how. You explained it very well in terms of why you would use a comic book as a loss leader if the end result is a couple of $1 billion, right?
And one of the things that I often talk about, because you've got older fans. And older fans are like, oh, the comics they put out now I don't like. Well, we're living in this golden age of comic book reprints.
Right.
Think to yourself, you're back in 1971. If you wanted to read every Fantastic Four story, you would have to pay money to buy those back issues, and maybe they'd be hard to find. And even back then, Fantastic Four #1 was probably $20-$30. And for a 15-year-old kid, that's a lot of money in 1971.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I live in a world now where on my tablet, I subscribe to Marvel Unlimited. They have comics going all the way back to Marvel Comics #1 in 1939. Anything they've ever reprinted is on there. Anything that's ever been digitized is on there. I can read Fantastic Four #1 up to today on my tablet whenever I want. DC has a similar service. I didn't read the Batman stuff in the 70s because I was a Marvel zombie. I'm reading the Batman stories from after the TV show when they went, oh crap, our sales are falling apart. We need to make Batman serious, up until the 80s. That's when Neil Adams was put on Batman to try and save it.
Right.
I'm reading these stories for an annual fee. Get to read them all.
Yes. Not bad. I do have some comic Marvel Masterwork editions on my Kindle, or I buy them through Kindle and read them that way. I have bought books from the Marvel Masterwork series and DC as well, whatever that series is called, of reprints.
DC Archives.
That's right. And, Justice League I was a big fan of, so I bought one of those books. I got a Fantastic Four and Iron Man. That's the stuff. To me, it's like going back and being a kid again. My brain is jumbled. I need to get to sleep somehow. Hand me that Iron Man,
Yeah.
It's like, and it's great. And you know what? They look fantastic. The color reproductions on these new books are fabulous, and it's keeping my old school Jones alive. We'll put it that way.
One of the great things about these reprints are even if they don't have what it used to be is they'd take the art, they'd scan it, they'd make film, they'd send it to Sparta, Illinois, they'd print the comics, the film would be shipped back. And maybe it would be taken care of and maybe it wouldn't. Well, now, let's say they're missing an issue. You can scan that issue. You've got the production people who are just brilliant, can bring outlines that look like they were there but weren't, so they were kind of lost in the printing process, so that it looks better than when it was printed back then. Because they're able to use Photoshop or whatever else and get a perfect copy of what was supposed to be printed. Now, those masterworks, they spare no expense in making sure that those are the best possible versions of those stories. They've also got these books called omnibuses, which are the masterwork for Fantastic Four. The first one reprinted the first 10 issues. The omnibus reprints the first 35. So it's bigger, it costs more. But they're going back and, all right, we're going to rescan this stuff. We're going to put it through because the technology's better now. You're never going to see Jack Kirby's art better than you see it right now. You're never going to see a Neil Adams art better than you see it right now. And the printing now, one of the other things people talk about is, we need to go back to the newsprint. First off, newsprint is more expensive than the slick paper they're using because nobody uses newsprint anymore, not even newspapers.
Right.
But by the time you got to, I started reading in the 70s. When I go back and I pick up a comic from 1975, the paper is so bad, you can actually see the wood, the wood pulp at times. And it's so thin, you can read the ad on the other side. So this art looks awful. But you pick up the reprint, and it's just this beautiful John Buscema stuff. Even the artists you may not have liked back then, their art looks so much better that you'll go, wow, Don Heck really was a much better artist than I thought he was when I was a kid.
There you go, right? Because you're seeing it clearly. You're seeing it with vivid colors as opposed to the somewhat washed out, like you say, newsprint style. And it was, that's true. You could see... You could see the next page from the right page. It was kind of frustrating at times.
And the ink would sort of blot up. So you'd have artists who were doing these very fine line work, and then when it's printed, it just comes out as kind of a blob because the ink would soak into the paper. You had a number of artists in the 70s who quit working for Marvel and DC because the reproduction of their stuff was so terrible. They couldn't stand seeing their art like that anymore. And they moved on to commercial art and other things. But now the way the art looks on the page, it might as well just be that's the finished page, as perfect as it is on the Bristol board that they drew it on.
Interesting. I got a question for you.
Sure.
Comic books looked a certain way in the 60s and 70s when I was a reader. Today's comics seem darker, starker, more adult. Do you think that limits today's audience to an extent in terms of, I can't imagine many 10-year-olds are going to go out and buy some of the titles that are out now that are kind of gritty and adult themed. What do you think of that?
I think one of the things that happened in the 90s and 2000s, and even now, the companies understand that, so they have, if you pick up an issue of the X-Men, it's going to be for people who've been reading the X-Men for a long time. But if you pick up an issue of Ms. Marvel, that's an all-ages book because it's a younger character. The color palette they're going to use is brighter. The stories are going to be lighter. They're not going to have the grim and gritty. Marvel has a number of really good all-ages books. If you're looking for a book for your kid, by the way, right now, Spider-Boy is probably the most fun thing Marvel is putting out. They recently had a story. The villain was able to... They had this thing where if he used it on you, you were erased from the web of life, which meant not only did you disappear, but everybody's memories of you went away. you were wiped from existence. So at the end of the story, they bring all the characters back, and they bring back a character that nobody remembers called Spider-Boy, who has been saying, hey, I'm Spider-Man's kid sidekick. Spider-Man, I never had a kid sidekick. So it's kind of a continuity implant. But the reason they did it is because we want to get these new readers. We want to get these younger readers. So here's kind of a kid Spider-Man that we don't have to, change continuity for or anything. And the stories are much lighter. They're much sillier. They're fun. They're pure fun. The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. So much fun. Such a fun character. By the way, that character was created by Steve Ditko back in the 80s. Everybody forgot her.
Oh my gosh, Ditko worked into the 80s, really?
Oh, Ditko worked until he passed.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was doing self-published stuff all through the 2000s.
Interesting. Wow, that's a career right there.
Oh, he never stopped working, ever.
That's great. That's nice to hear that.
But he and Will Murray, Will Murray's somebody who's just fascinating because he's written comics. He's the guy who's writing the new Doc Savage novels, the new Spider novels, the new Shadow novels. He wrote Remo Williams, The Destroyer, for about 75 books. But he and Steve Ditko did this one shot for Squirrel Girl that was put in a drawer somewhere. And then it got, it was an inventory story for a fill-in somewhere. And it got published. People forgot about it until like the early 2000s when one of the writers said, hey, I'm going to use this character. She's silly. And I'm going to use her. And, here's a character, hadn't been seen for 15 years. Starts using her. She explodes in popularity. Why? Because it's a book that kids can read.
That's
Over
great.
in DC, they have young adult graphic novels they're putting out. There are a number of publishers that are putting out comics for kids. And there was a big worry in the 80s and 90s about, putting labels on. This is for mature readers. This is for teens. This is for this.
Right.
Because they were worried that, the ones that say mature readers, that's like waving a red flag saying, hey, these are the comics you're going to, the politicians and the people who want to get publicity are going to jump on. That didn't happen. Instead, those are the books that went into bookstores, like Sandman, like Dark Knight, like Watchmen. But you've also got all these comics that are kid-friendly. And most comic shops, when you go in, they've got the kid-friendly books in one place, but you can also tell by the covers. You look at a Batman, and the color palette is darker, and the art is much more detailed. But if you look for the Batman and Robin Adventures or the other kid books, the art is a simpler color, a lighter color palette, because lighter colors are what draw kids in.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And also kids just have gravitated toward Japanese comics with Pokemon and One Piece and Yu-Gi-Oh! And all of those, because they're brighter, they're more action. They don't have a problem reading right to left, whereas here in America we read left to right.
Mm-hmm.
But kids have no problem picking up that Pokemon book and reading it, right to left. Turn the pages. You're turning back through the book. And it took me a while to kind of, I have to turn this book around to read it.
Wow. The Pokemon phenomenon is just that, because it's like, I can't believe it's lasted this long. I mean, what is it, 25 years at this point? Longer?
Yeah. I knew it would last because of one thing. Kids like collecting stuff.
Right.
So the whole, you got to catch them all. You might as well just, say, here, kid, here, this is drugs for kids. When you were a kid, you probably had trading cards and there'd be a number on it. This is number 75 of 102. Well, I got to get all 102 of them.
Right. In fact, this is called the Outdated Entertainment Hour. Pokemon goes back far enough. I mean, it's amazing how it has held as a cultural phenomenon. It really has. It's, Oh, man. What a success story it's been.
And it's because the people involved, a lot of people say, oh, it's just marketing. No, it's kind of an introduction to video games for kids. The cards are collectibles, and kids love collectibles. And the stories are very much, this kid is going on a quest to be the best at whatever. Well, kids love that sort of thing too. You've got a 12-year-old protagonist that you can follow as he's learning lessons and growing and going through things.
Yep.
So,
and you know what? I know that those stories are written. I was in children's publishing for a short amount of time, and I know that those stories were written with that certain little flair that attracts both boys and girls, which is a rarity. And on top of it, it never crosses a line into anything violent or very, very, like I said, not dark. It's all very bright, and I think that's a good thing. And you know what? I never had any children, but I certainly let them, play with Pokemon and read the comics. That's for sure.
I was a single dad, and when my son got to be about 7 or 8, Marvel was putting out these books called Essentials, which were big reprints. They were like a 500-page reprint of older stuff in black and white on cheap paper. And my son picked up Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, those Ditko stories, the first 25 issues. Fell in love. This was stuff that was 30 years old at the time. Fell in love with it. Why? Because if you do good stuff, first, it's universal. Everybody has felt like Peter Parker, where, oh, I'm the kid who's left out. Or with Superman, if people knew how cool I was, they'd like me. And that's the whole thing of Superman, where, it's changed over time and everything. But it was, Lois Lane loves Superman, but doesn't much care about Clark Kent. Well, if she just knew that I was Superman or Batman, you know what? I was powerless, but I'm going to do everything I can to fix this. Those things are universal. And when they're done right, they work for the 7-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 30-year-old, the 60-year-old. I could go back and I can read Ditko Spider-Man, and I read it different from when I was a kid reading a Ditko Spider-Man or a young adult reading a Ditko Spider-Man, because I'm bringing different things to it.
Hey, since the name of this thing is outdated, let's go back in time a little bit.
Okay.
I want to jog your memory, if you even know what I'm about to talk about. I have a feeling you will, because you seem to know everything about comics.
I have a frightening amount of information about comics.
Well, there
My co-host has learned that if he brings up Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Joe Maneely, Jack Davis, he can literally put the headphones down, go get a snack, come back, and I'm still talking.
There you go. All right, here we go then. It's 1966, the Batman craze, right?
Yep.
The Adam West show is a big hit for about one season on ABC. They kept it going, but it wasn't as big after that first year. But in any event, everybody was trying to jump on that bandwagon. Marvel Comics reaches an agreement with a company called Grand Trade Lawrence Animation to do a animated series called The Marvel Superheroes.
Yep.
Which featured Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, and the Submariner. It is widely considered one of the worst cartoons of all time because basically they took panels like from the famous artists like Kirby and whatnot, and just flashed them on the screen, and maybe a mouth would move or something like that. And for movement, you would just see a still figure go across the screen as opposed to any kind of actual walking or running or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yet I loved that show with a passion. They had some great voice actors. Those themes were unbelievable. Everybody knows the Iron Man theme. I thought it still is one of my all-time favorite animated series, as limited as it was. My question for you, do you remember this series? Do you agree with my summation? And where the heck is it? Because it's available nowhere.
All right, I'm going to give you some background on it.
Okay.
You have to remember, 1966, Marvel had not really been around all that long. Fantastic Four started in 61. Let's see. Thor was 63. Hulk was 62, and then it failed, was canceled, and replaced by the Sergeant Fury series. Iron Man had been started in 63, so these comics had only been around 3-4 years.
Right.
They're not going to get any of the big name animators. They're not even going to get the medium name animators like Filmation. They got this small company in New York who had no money. And what it was, they were going to make these 10-minute cartoons and sell them to local stations.
Right.
Now, by the time I was old enough to know what was going on, they weren't being shown. But in Peoria, there was a show called Captain Jinx and Salty Sam. It was an hour-long kids show,
Right.
with 2 hosts, and they would show Deputy Dog and the Marvel cartoons with introductions by the hosts and everything. And they'd have, like about 10 kids in the audience. And when you're at home watching it, you thought, it was a huge audience. But they were syndicated that way. And the stories were just, we're going to adapt this story from the Marvel comic. We're going to do this story, and we're going to cut out, and do the animation that way. And I don't know where you can see them now. I have seen them as an adult, knowing these stories, because I've read the stories over and over and over again.
Right.
It's very much wow, they didn't have any money at all. But if you look at other cheap cartoons from the time, you've probably seen Clutch Cargo.
Oh, sure. Space Ghost. All those things were just the cheesiest.
Space Ghost was fully animated. That was
but I still think that was kind of,
Well, yeah, it was Hanna-Barbera was the ones who did 2 frames a second. But Clutch Cargo is still picture with the superimposed mouth.
Mouths, yeah.
And they also did we're going to do a drawing, and rather than the drawing move, we'll just move the camera.
Right.
Because, if you're going to sell these cartoons, and you're not selling them to NBC, CBS, or ABC, you're not going to get a lot of money. So you're not going to make a lot of money.
Right.
So, you had Space Ghost, which looked okay for, network TV. But if you don't have the money for that, you're going to do this, and kids will watch cartoons anyway. And TV stations were always looking for dirt cheap entertainment,
right,
that they could fill the time with.
Oh, that's why Popeye and Three Stooges ran for 30 years. It was available. You could get it.
Well, and then you'd have, if a movie was public domain, guess what? You're going to be seeing that movie,
right,
a lot. Yeah. The reason why everybody thinks It's a Wonderful Life is this long beloved Christmas movie. It was a public domain movie for decades that kind of had a Christmas theme.
Right.
So I remember there were, in Peoria, there were 3 stations and a PBS station. 2 of them would show It's a Wonderful Life at least twice during the Christmas season because, hey, we could put this on 10:30 at night, run ads, and it's public domain, so it costs us nothing. I imagine those Marvel cartoons, hey, you want to give us $50 to run it? There you go. Give us the $50. There it is.
Right. And yet, those cartoons, the voice of Iron Man was John Vernon, who later became Dean Wormer in the Animal House film. And a couple of the other voice actors were actors that later appeared, The thing about it was this. I was attracted to because I was reading the Marvel comics, and there was a full-page ad. Marvel Comics coming to television. And they listed my local station in Albany, New York, WTEN. I said, oh my gosh, this is awesome. So where did they stick it? Just like with you, they stuck it in the Commander Ralph show.
See?
The Commander Ralph Vardigan. He was also the weatherman for the station. Those were the days. And he would come out and he's pretending to be on a ship, boat. And he had his sailor hat on, and he would do wraparound introductions for these. As you remember, there were 3 segments to the Marvel. There'd be a beginning, middle cartoon, and an end cartoon that wrapped up the story. And it lost a little something in translation because I never got to see Merry Marvel Marching Society closing theme or the opening credits. All they showed was the cartoons. And I was always kind of disappointed with that. I've seen them later on.
Yeah.
But I didn't see them at the time.
But along with that, you also had a Fantastic Four cartoon on Network.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You had the Ralph Bashki Spider-Man cartoon.
Right, but you know that the first season of that was Grant Ray Loris as well.
Yes.
And then they, of course, went bankrupt. as you noted, they had no money. And then Bakshi and those were awful. The Bakshi Spider-Mans were I thought they were terrible.
But again, they had no money.
Yeah, but you know what? They would reuse the same shot of him flinging his web going through the city 5 or 6 times in a single cartoon. You're right. It looked like they ran out of money.
Well, it's like those Filmation cartoons. I recently went back and watched the Star Trek cartoon, and oh my gosh, so much reused animation over and over. But when you're a kid and it's only on once a week, it doesn't hit you the same as when you're an adult watching it on a DVD. You forgive a lot of that. And Stan was just so unbelievably happy that this stuff got picked up. Here was this guy, and forgive me, I'm going to go on a Stan Lee thing here.
Go right ahead.
There are a lot of people.
I'm glad you are, because what's this outdated entertainment like Stan Lee, the creator, one of the creators of Marvel, and a legend in his own time. He really was.
One of the things, Stan Lee gets a lot of crap nowadays from people who he didn't give enough credit, et cetera, et cetera. Stan Lee got into comics when he was 17, back in 1940, as a gopher. His job was to get coffee, refill inkwells, and then by 1942, he was the editor-in-chief at Timely, which became Marvel, because everybody else had been drafted. He eventually is drafted. When he comes back, they have 2 editors-in-chief. You have Vince Vago, who is in charge of all the funny animal stuff and all the humor comics and all of that. And Stan was everything else. Your crime, your superhero, your romance, your all of that. And Stan worked at Marvel the rest of his life. He dealt with a scumbag publisher, Martin Goodman. It would take me too long to go into it, but Martin Goodman, who was the publisher at Timely and all these horrible, exploitative magazines, he was very much a whatever's popular, we put out 30 of it, who was always cutting costs and always cutting costs and always cutting costs. And Stan would be the guy in charge of comics. So he was the editor, and he was the guy who was finding talent to fill all these books. In the 50s, in the early 50s, Marvel was publishing, over 100 books. And then by the time you get to 1958, when the distribution collapse happened and everything, Marvel's distribution was being handled by DC, National Periodicals, and DC didn't want the comics. They wanted all the Men's Sweat magazines. Now, Men's Sweat magazines, I don't know if you've talked about those on previous episodes. They're the magazines like Male, for men only.
Right.
The ones with Weasels Rip My Flesh and, He-Man magazines and everything.
Right. Spicy detective magazines, that kind of thing.
They wanted that.
Mm-hmm.
But Martin had made so much money over comics. He says, you got to take the comics. Okay, fine. You can have 8 comics a month. And Stan moved from those 8 comics a month. He brought in Jack Kirby. He brought in Steve Ditko. He brought in Don Heck. He brought in John Buscemi. He brought in Gene Colan. He brought in John Romita. He brought in all these artists and played to their strengths. Building Marvel. Think about it. 1961, they're publishing monster comics that barely sell 150,000 copies each. In 1966, they have a contract for cartoons.
Right.
For, Fantastic Four, which have been around 5 years. Spider-Man, which have been around for 4 years. The other books that had only been around 2 or 3 years. I can't think of any comic that was published 3 years ago that's going to get a national TV show.
Mm-hmm. Right. You make a good point. Those Marvel, with the exception of Captain America, Hulk, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Thor, go down the list, they were all hits. It's amazing. And the characters became, if you say, Fantastic Four, somebody's going to know who it is. But at the time, they were up against the DC giant where some of those characters were on for 30 years.
They were also up against Dell, which was publishing all of the Hanna-Barbera characters, all of the Disney characters. Marvel really was an explosion. And even the characters have failed. Hulk failed. If you've read the first issues of the Hulk, they're a nightmare. Every issue, his powers are different. The way he becomes the Hulk is different. They have no idea what they're doing. Kirby does 4 issues. Ditko does 2. It's canceled due to low sales. Did they just, the heck with the Hulk? No. We're going to keep using the character. We're going to put him in the Fantastic Four. We're going to put him in the Avengers. We're going to do this. And then when we bring him back for a series, we'll have an idea of what we're doing with them. You read those early issues of the Hulk, it wasn't when he gets mad, he becomes the Hulk. He became the Hulk at night. And then, he's got to blast himself with radiation to become the Hulk again. It wasn't until those years later when they used the Hulk and kind of figured out what to do with him that is, okay, when Bruce Banner gets angry, he becomes the Hulk. So even their failures, they just kind of pulled them back, did it again, and made them hits.
Mm-hmm.
That I have no problem saying that Stan took a lot of credit for writing because he thought that scripting the books were writing and some of the plot elements and the pacing and everything were done by the artist. But if you look at Stan Lee as an editor, there was never a better editor in comics.
Good point. Excellent point. I give you excellent observation. Really, seriously.
Yeah.
They had such a good narrative flow. The use of captions, the use of thought balloons. I mean, it was kind of innovative. I mean, DC wasn't doing that stuff.
No, DC was very much the editors at DC had come from pulp magazines. They did not have a background in comics. Stan spent his whole career in comics. Julie Swartz started in pulp magazines. Mort Weisinger started in pulp comics. Bob, on down the line, Bob Kanigher started in, fiction magazines. So when you picked up a DC book, the layouts were all the same. The stories were very much, okay, here's a puzzle. The hero solves the puzzle. Or with the books aimed at kids, it was, there's some weird thing happening on the cover. Why is Superman ignoring this fire and instead dancing with a Beatles wig? You got to read the story to find out.
Right.
The other thing about Stan as an editor, look at the artists he brought in.
No kidding.
Ditko had been working over at Carlton. Nobody cared about Ditko. He brought in Ditko. Ditko did his best work. Kirby had been fired from DC, could not get a job anywhere, was pretty much thought up as washed up. Kirby gets brought in. Stan empowers him to use that creativity. John Romita was the #1 romance artist at DC. They go, we're not going to publish romance anymore. Well, can I draw other stuff? Nah, you're a romance artist. He brings him in, puts him on Spider-Man. Spider-Man sales explode. On and on and on. You look at the people. He knew how to cast the artist to the story.
I'll tell you what. I want to put a little bow on this. I can recall being 10 years old in my room with my comic book, escaping the whole world for an hour or two. And I'm telling you, I was hooked. I was into it. It was fun. It enhanced my life. And I'm sure you feel the same way and probably has a similar memory, if I'm not mistaken.
For me, I lived in the middle of nowhere.
Me too. Well, me too. I'll tell you that much too.
Outside a town of 250 people.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's even smaller than my town. Okay. All right.
I would read comics. I read books. Everything that came in, I was a voracious reader. But there was something about comics that really hooked me. And then, you reach the age where, I'm going to give up comics, go after girls. Well, I didn't do that. I still went after girls, but I kept the comics. And by the time I was in college, I was working at a video store and there was a comic shop downstairs, and the owner would bring up comics to have me sort of process the back issues, put them in bags, put them in boards, look up the price, et cetera, et cetera. And then when I got out of college, I got a job at a comic shop, worked there for 4 years, and I just kind of never left. And I have this insatiable curiosity. And I keep digging and digging and digging and digging to find out more about the history of comics, because in a lot of ways, it's just this, it's a story of publishing, but it's also a story of how America has changed over the years.
Absolutely.
I always talk about, right now, Rachel Maddow has a podcast called Ultra, where she goes into the far right wing before World War II, and kind of how that's all been erased from our history. If you think about World War II, you usually think, well, in America, we always hated the Nazis, and then when Pearl Harbor was bombed, we went right after them. Well, no, that's not what happened. We had a prominent Nazi movement in the U.S., and the way I found out about it was, I'm a huge Jack Kirby fan. So he told the story about Captain America #1. He and Joe Simon put together Captain America #1. And he was Jewish, and Simon was Jewish, and they had a lot of relatives over in Germany who were telling them what was happening. So this is 1940. They put out a comic of Captain America smashing Hitler in the face. This is a year before we go into World War II. This is when Henry Ford got this award from Hitler for being, such a great man and publishing these books about the truth about the Jews. And Charles Lindbergh was having huge rallies about how we need to stay out of the war. Germany's our friend. And, their style of government, we think that's a pretty good style of government. So what does that have to do with the Captain America #1? They put out Captain America #1 with Captain America smashing Hitler in the face. They got death threats. They got newsstands, especially in the South, that would say, we are not putting this on the stands. Kirby talked about there was one time somebody said that they were in the, I'm down here in the lobby. I'm going to come up there and I'm going to beat the crap out of you. Kirby grabbed the T, the big T that artists use so that they have straight lines, grabbed that, got in the elevator and went down to beat the crap out of the guy, but he was gone. So comics have intertwined with our history. And the more I learn about the history of comics, the more I've learned about history altogether. Like I talked about with that magazine distribution collapse. That was a huge cultural touchstone, because not only did comics fall apart, but that was the end of most newsprint magazines, because the new distributor said, well, we just want Slex. It got rid of the fiction magazines because they were all on the pulpy paper. It killed a lot of paperback book lines, so that now you've only got a few publishers of paperback books. Why is that? Well, you dig through and find out, well, here's the backbone of why this stuff happened.
I mean, you've really done a fantastic job, so thank you for being here.
Sure.
And I want to give you the floor. Tell the good people out there where they can find you in your various guises. You're probably even busier than I am, and I never sleep. So tell me what's going on with your podcast and everything else.
All right. If you go to Crazy Comics, KRAYZ, COMIX.solitairerose.com, that's where we have Crazy Comics and Stories, where Mia and Joe talk comics every week. We've had 2 episodes this week. The first one was, should Marvel have brought Jean Grey back from the dead in 1986? The second one is about the current X-Men relaunch, why it's happening, why Marvel's doing it, who's involved in it, and are the first issues any good? I also have solo podcasts where I do interviews with people. I have one that's dropping in a couple of days for a artist who is doing a comic called Confederate Monster, which is Frankenstein in the Civil War. And all he had to do was tell me that, and it's like, I'm in. That sounds great. I also write and do audios for PWInsiderElite.com. Myself and Anthony Pyrus every Wednesday after AEW Dynamite is over. We break it down. We've got a pretty good dynamic because I like what I like. You've probably heard the enthusiasm in my voice when I'm watching AEW. Hey, this is fun. And Anthony's the one, wait a minute. They screwed this up. I don't like this. I don't like this. So you've got a good contrast to somebody who, hey, I like having fun. And Anthony, who breaks it down more. And I also do recaps of a number of shows there. In between that, I also have 2 jobs.
Mm-hmm.
One of which I want to talk about a little bit. I work part-time with developmentally disabled adults. I got that job during the Great Recession because I had worked in juvenile justice for years, and I had gotten out of it. But then in the Great Recession, it's, well, I got to have something. I want to work in group homes because I've got years of experience in that, but I don't want to work with teenage boys anymore. So I started working with developmentally disabled adults. And I have to tell you, if you're ever looking for a job, it is the greatest job you can have. Imagine a job where you come into work and they cheer. They're happy to see you. They want to do things with you. And you are sharing a part of your life. You're giving back. And I think one of the big things that we in America, and hopefully other people, but here in America, there's all this tension between us. You know, we're divided into different groups. But if you spend your time helping people, you don't care about those groups anymore. You just care about helping people. And then in my spare time,
what spare time?
I try to figure out if I have spare time.
Right. Oh man, what a delight this has been. You're going to have to come back, you know. One episode of this is not enough. And I know there's a lot of comics fans out there. And I think you should, if you have time, please grace us with your presence one more time. I insist.
I will happily do it. As a matter of fact, if people will send you topics,
right,
I could probably take over.
All right. Did you hear that, gang? If you have any questions, any topics. Oh, one more thing from me.
Sure.
I used to subscribe to Marvel Comics. Late 60s, early 70s, and doggone it, they used to fold them and put them in a brown paper sleeve.
Yeah.
Awful. Right?
There are collectors who call that the subscription crease.
Right.
When I subscribed, it was, I finally talked my parents into it in 77. You know what they had in the subscription ad? Huge letters across the top. Now mailed flat.
Right. Oh, there's never been a comic subscriber who didn't go, what is this? So, yeah, I never appreciated that, considering that one of my Silver Surfers was sent that way. And number one, I had 2 of those. And I looked it up the other day. The thing is worth so much money. I'm going to cry right in front of you.
Yeah.
I insisted if I was allowed to keep my comics collection, I could have put a kid through college. Of course, I don't have any kids, but I could have. I'm telling you.
There was a comic shop in the 80s, I think in South Carolina. The name of the shop was My Mom Threw Mine Away, because the owner had so many people come
my gosh,
to tell him that. And that's why those old comics are worth money.
Right.
I often talk about, people will, I'm going to short circuit a question that you're going to get. How can I invest in comics now? Well, you're not going to be able to, because you don't know what's going to get picked up for a movie or a TV show that goes insane. I remember Walking Dead #1. I told my shop, I want 10 of these. I want 10 of this #1 when it comes out, because I was a huge zombie fan. And the guy who was writing it, Robert Kirkman, said, this is like what happens after the George Romero movies. Oh, I'm in. I'm all in. Now, first off, that comic's worth a ton of money. The second thing is, when I came in to pick up mine, they were all sold out. And this was the next day that they had come out. Right. And I said, I told you I wanted 10. Well, we didn't think you were serious.
Oh, of course you were serious.
Don't buy modern comics to invest in. It's like anything else. Buy the old stuff.
And there's a lot of things that had a height that are not what they once were. Baseball cards are not as collectible because once the collectability market exploded, it's all old stuff. It's not the new stuff. People are collecting the new stuff thinking it's going to appreciate, and it just isn't.
No,
because there's too much of it around.
How many of those boxes, how many of those sets of 1989 Score, the complete run,
right,
do you see at flea markets and baseball card shops and everything? And they're selling for less than when they came out. Why? Because everybody has them.
Yep.
Everybody who wants it has it.
Well, when it comes to investments, my friend, I admire you. You know why? Because you're investing in people. That's the best investment of them all. So my hat's off to you, what you do in your part-time job there. I think that's wonderful. I really do. I had no idea, and that's a really great thing. My old friend Bill Apter is doing a similar thing too, and I admire both of you for helping people.
It's weird how many connections I have to Bill Apter. I've never talked to him.
Is that right?
Yeah. I hear he is a lot of fun.
He is.
And Dave Shearer has told some great stories about him.
Yeah, Bill is he's one of a kind. Great sense of humor. Could you imagine, like I did for 7 years, working in an office with him? My goodness. He is a very funny human being, the world's biggest Jerry Lewis fan, and loves to do karaoke and all the other things. He does a one-man show now for wrestling fans. He never stops. He's still working. He's as busy now as he was when I worked with him back in the 90s. So it's like, what can I tell you?
There's just there are some people like me who, when you see spare time, you go, you know what? I've got this idea. Why don't I do that? It'll just, it won't take a whole lot, and then it takes over.
Yep. The same thing happened with me, my friend. I was a musician for 15 years and got records played. And, it's like, if you don't stick your neck out and go, I'd really like to do this, you'll never experience what it's like to do it. So if I need two advices for young people, number one, save your money. Number two, live your life. It's like, if you got something that's really like tugging you by the sleeve and you really feel like you want to do it, do it. You only get one of these lifetimes. I've heard.
There's the old W.C. Fields quote I like. If at first you don't succeed, try again, then give up. No use being a damn fool about it. And what that means is try everything.
Right.
Do it all.
Mm-hmm.
You may not be good at it. Who cares?
Yep.
Try it. Maybe you'll enjoy it. Maybe you'll be good at it. But if you're not, move on to the next thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. Folks, Cory Strode, what a absolute delight. What a pleasure. And this is a good show. I think people are going to like this one. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. And please check out our podcast. If you like it, you've got over 1,000 hours of comics history to listen to.
I've got plenty of time to do that. No, I am definitely going to tune in. Now that I know that you do it, I am there. I promise you. I'll mention it again. Once I listen to a couple episodes, I'll mention again on the show my thoughts about this. So now you got to listen to my show to find out what I'm going to say about your show. What do you think of that?
Well, that gives me something to do when I'm driving to the group home.
There you go. Oh, our podcast's great when you're driving. It's the best.
Yeah.
It is. It's the best. It just keeps you awake, and something will jog your memory or make you laugh. It's excellent. And tell Anthony I said, hey, man.
All right. And I will use the line we use at the end of our podcast. The comic we like the least, we still like better than the comic that you like the most.
There you go. I can't top that one. Thank you, Cory.
Sure.
Well, that puts a nice little bow on our program for today. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll do our usual commercial announcements now. Our website is outdatedentertainment.buzzsprout.com, where you can hear every one of our shows right then and there. Of course, we're also available on every podcast app I can think of, plus YouTube, minus TuneIn. I don't know why. Apparently, they're not taking new podcasts right now. I don't understand it, but we'll find out what's going on with them hopefully in the future. I like TuneIn. I listen to TuneIn all the time. They have simulcast of television and stuff like that in there, but what can you do? You got to follow the rules, babies. So in any event, also, find me on Facebook. I'm the guy singing with B.B. King. As you know, I was a blues singer on the road under the name of Robert Charles, Charles, and Robert Charles music can be found on Amazon and Spotify in the digital section. Write to us at outdatedent at gmail.com. That's outdatedent at gmail.com. So that's about it for now. We hope you had fun. I know I did. Cory's something else, isn't he? So until next time, my name is Bob Smith, and on both my podcasts, I leave us with this. The words of Ringo Starr, the legendary drummer for the Beatles. Now he has his own all-star band that's toured for probably, 3 decades now. All I know is this. He's right about one thing. He always says this at his concerts. Peace and love, brothers and sisters. Peace and love.